Nicole's father had warned her about dating apps. He looked his daughter in the eye and told her, "You never really know who is on the other side of the screen." But Nicole wasn't scared. She promised she would meet him in a public place. She promised she would be safe. On the morning of June 7th, 2015, her red Dodge Neon was found wedged between two trees on a quiet stretch of road in Graham, Washington. The keys were still in the ignition. The license plates had been ripped off, and the 28-year-old mother of two was gone. Police would spend weeks desperately searching for clues. What they didn't know was that the perpetrator had already handed them the most damning piece of evidence possible. He had accidentally documented his own crime in a way so careless and so unbelievable that investigators initially couldn't believe their eyes. How did a simple swipe on a screen lead to one of the most disturbing criminal cases Pierce County has ever seen? This is the case of Nicole White. Before we get to that fatal mistake, you need to understand who Nicole White was, and there is one physical detail about her that is absolutely crucial to this story. Nicole was tiny. She stood just 4 feet 10 inches tall, 147 centimeters, and weighed barely 100 pounds, 45 kilograms. But her dad used to say she always thought she was bigger than she actually was. She was fearless, fiercely protective, and above all else, she was a devoted mother to her 2 young boys. At the time of her disappearance in 2015, life was throwing a lot at Nicole. She was living in the small town of Orting, Washington, going through a grueling divorce and a messy custody battle over her kids. It's an exhausting, emotionally draining process. Her family noticed she was feeling down and lonely. Her boys were the only thing keeping her mentally strong. Like millions of people trying to rebuild their lives after a tough breakup, Nicole decided to put herself back out there. She downloaded Tinder and Plenty of Fish. Her mom and sister were supportive. They'd even swipe through profiles together, laughing and analyzing the guys. Her dad, Eddie, was the only one who had a bad feeling about it. He gave her that lecture about the hidden dangers of the internet. But Nicole was smart about it. She followed all the rules of modern dating. She met guys in public places. She told her family where she was going. She did everything right. And that's exactly what she did when she swiped right on a guy whose profile matched his imposing nickname. A guy who stood a massive 6'7". A guy named John. Jonathan Daniel Harris was 29 years old and lived in Graham, Washington, just a short drive from Nicole. If you put them next to each other, the physical contrast was almost comical. While Nicole was petite and fragile-looking, Jonathan was a mountain of a man. People literally called him Big John. He had worked as a bouncer at local bars, the kind of job where being physically imposing is basically your entire resume. To anyone else, a guy this massive might seem a little scary, but on the dating apps, he was charming. He and Nicole started chatting in the spring of 2015, and they hit it off. To Nicole, he just seemed like a normal, rough-around-the-edges Pacific Northwest guy. So she gave him a chance, and honestly, their first date went perfectly. They agreed to meet at a local spot called Jeepers Country Bar and Grill in Spanaway. It's a divey, comfortable place. Cheap drinks, live music, pool tables. But Nicole wasn't stupid. She was meeting a massive guy from the internet, so she played it safe. She brought her best friend Carrie along for the first meeting. Everything went exactly how you'd want a first date to go. Harris's friend, a fellow bouncer named Matt, was working the door that night and remembered seeing them together. They were laughing, flirting, having a few drinks. By the end of the night, Nicole told her family that John was a nice guy. He made her feel safe. She felt comfortable enough that for their second date, she didn't need a chaperone. She would go alone. That second date was set for Saturday, June 6, 2015. She had spent the day in a great mood, getting dressed up, excited to treat herself to a fun night out with a guy she was starting to really like. Before Nicole left that evening, she had a brief moment of hesitation. She turned to her best friend Kari and pleaded, "Come on, please go. I don't want to go by myself." But Kari couldn't make it. She told her, "Not tonight, next time." There would be no next time. Nicole promised she'd be home before midnight, maybe 1 a.m. at the latest. She had to work the next morning, and she wasn't the type to skip a shift. She got into her car and drove to Jonathan Harris's house in Graham to pick him up. Nicole and Harris arrived at Jeepers and stayed for about 4 hours. For a while, everything was great. Matt Martino, the bouncer, noticed Nicole looked genuinely happy. They had a couple of beverages, but neither of them was overly intoxicated. But then, the mood shifted. Harris's ex-girlfriend, the woman he'd been with for 5 years, walked into the bar. And she wasn't alone. She was with a new guy. Seeing an ex move on is tough for anyone. Most people would feel a flash of jealousy and just ignore it. Jonathan Harris didn't. According to Martino, Harris's demeanor changed completely. He went into the backyard, sitting by himself, just stewing in anger. Suddenly, he snapped. He grabbed a glass bottle and aggressively shattered it on the ground. Martino walked over and told him to knock it off. But later that night, in another sudden outburst, Harris hurled a second bottle across the patio area, breaking it against a wall. Again, the bouncer had to intervene. Picture this scene. You are a tiny woman on a date. You are watching a massive 6'7" man completely lose his temper, breaking glass just because his ex walked into the room. Do you leave? Do you run? Psychologists call what happens next the fawn or freeze response. When faced with sudden, unpredictable anger, individuals sometimes try to placate the person, to keep them calm, just to get through the night safely. Nicole stayed. When the bar finally closed, Nicole walked over to Harris and helped him up. Martino, the bouncer, gave Nicole a hug, shook Harris's hand, and told them to be safe. Martino watched them walk out and get into the Dodge. That was the last time anyone outside of Jonathan Harris saw Nicole White alive. The next morning, Nicole did not come home. Her mother, Jill, immediately called Nicole's job. She never showed up. Around the same time, Nicole's father realized she hadn't come to drop off her son. Her best friend called, no one had heard from her, and her phone was going straight to voicemail. For a devoted mother, this was completely out of character. As her sister put it, Nicole would never just run away. Her boys were her entire life. The family immediately called the police. Within hours, the community mobilized. Every single day, between 150 and 200 volunteers combed through rural Pierce County. The weather was brutal, pushing 90 degrees, 32 degrees Celsius. But strangers and friends alike spent days trekking through the wilderness. Then, on June 8th, 2 days after the date, they found something. Down a rural road near Graham, searchers spotted Nicole's car. It was heavily pinned between 2 trees. The keys were still in the ignition. But when detectives arrived, they took one look at the scene and immediately knew this wasn't a tragic traffic accident. Someone had deliberately parked the vehicle there to stage a crash. And there was one chilling detail that proved it. The license plates had been removed. If Nicole had just driven off the road, why would she take off her own license plates? She wouldn't. Someone else put that car there to delay the police from identifying it. Search and rescue dogs were brought in. They immediately picked up a scent leading away from the car, up a hill, and straight toward a series of deep retention ponds. Thinking the worst, investigators spent hours draining 40,000 gallons of water from those ponds. They found absolutely nothing. No evidence. No Nicole. In any missing persons case, the first question detectives ask is simple. Who was the last person to see the victim alive? On June 7th, detectives drove out to Graham to knock on Jonathan Harris's door. When the lead detective reached out to introduce himself, he immediately noticed something chilling as they shook hands. Harris had a terrifying grip. His hands were enormous. This was a man whose sheer physical size could overpower almost anyone. Detectives asked him to walk them through the end of the night. Harris played it cool. He told them that after they left the bar, he asked Nicole for a quick ride to a nearby AM/PM convenience store. She agreed. According to Harris, she parked. He went inside to grab something, and when he walked back out, she was gone. She had just driven off. So, what did he do? Harris claimed he used the payphone outside the AM/PM to try and call her, but she didn't answer. Assuming he was stranded, he just walked home. It sounded like a clean, simple story, except for the fact that it was entirely made up. When detectives went to verify his timeline, his alibi fell apart in spectacular fashion. First, they checked the AM/PM. There was no payphone. It didn't exist. Second, investigators pulled the store's surveillance footage. Jonathan Harris never walked through the door. He never appeared on any camera. Not once. And finally, there was the logic of his so-called walk home. Harris's house was about 6 miles away from that store. Based on what he was wearing at the bar, detectives knew Harris had cowboy boots on that night. Walking a 6-mile stretch of dark road at 3 in the morning is exhausting on its own, but doing it in heavy cowboy boots, it just didn't make sense. None of it added up. When detectives confronted Harris and the questions started getting harder, his demeanor changed. The confident, massive bouncer suddenly started to panic. He began having what looked like a severe anxiety attack, and the interview had to be cut short. But before they left, detectives noticed one final detail that Harris absolutely refused to explain. He had fresh, visible injuries on his body, scrapes and marks indicating a recent struggle, and when asked how he got them, Harris went dead silent. With his alibi completely blown apart within hours, detectives knew they weren't just looking for a missing mother anymore, but knowing someone is lying and proving they committed a crime are two very different things. They needed hard evidence. The investigation exploded in scale. The FBI was brought in, bringing massive federal resources to the hunt. Pierce County detectives were aggressively retracing every step of that Saturday night. And then a judge signed a search warrant for Jonathan Harris's home. Remember how I told you that to Nicole? Jonathan just seemed like a normal local guy. When police breached the doors of his house, they realized just how wrong she was. Harris's home wasn't just a house. It was an armory. Detectives found hundreds of weapon parts, components, and thousands of rounds of ammunition scattered around. And here is the terrifying detail Nicole never knew. Jonathan Harris was a convicted felon with a history of serious offenses. In 2009, Harris was convicted of a serious second-degree felony. According to court records, the incident involved the highly reckless use of a firearm in the presence of others. Thankfully, no one was injured, but that specific conviction resulted in a strict, lifetime ban on him possessing any weapons or ammunition. Detectives immediately arrested him, not for the tragedy regarding Nicole, not yet, but for being a felon in possession of firearms. It was a tactical move. It got a dangerous, desperate man off the streets and locked in a cell while they frantically continued the search. But all those weapons wouldn't solve Nicole's disappearance. The real breakthrough, the piece of evidence that would break this case wide open, came from a device Harris probably hadn't even thought about. After his disastrous interview, Jonathan Harris knew the police were onto him. So, he tried to be smart. He tried to manufacture a paper trail. Detectives pulled his phone records and found that on June 7th, after Nicole had already vanished, Harris called her phone multiple times. Why? Because he's trying to play the part of the concerned guy whose date never made it home. He also sent a very calculated text message to a friend, casually asking, "Hey, did I get into a fight last night?" He was planting a seed, building a fake alibi for those fresh physical injuries. He really thought he had covered his tracks. But in 2015, your digital footprint is always louder than your lies. First, detectives looked at his cell tower pings. On the morning of June 7th, his phone didn't ping at his house, or the AM/PM. It pinged miles away, deep in a remote, heavily forested area south of Lake Kapowsin. But cell pings are only approximate. To put him away, they needed something visual, something undeniable. And that is when Jonathan Harris's own criminal past came back to destroy him. Because Harris had a previous DUI conviction, his truck was legally required to be fitted with an ignition interlock device, a breathalyzer wired straight into the engine. But here is the critical feature of that specific device. Every single time the driver blows into it to start the car, a hidden camera takes a time-stamped photograph. Detectives pulled the data from his truck. They clicked open the photo taken on the morning of June 7th. There was Jonathan Harris, blowing into the machine. But behind his head, through the truck windows, they didn't see his driveway. They didn't see a road. They saw dense, rural timberland. Detectives compared the trees and the terrain in that little photo to the geography south of Lake Kapowsin. It was a perfect match. The man had literally taken a selfie at the site of his own crime. While digital forensics were mapping out Harris's movements, detectives decided to dig deeper into his mind. They tracked down his ex-girlfriend, the same woman whose appearance at the bar had sent Harris into a destructive bottle-smashing episode. What she told them added a chilling new layer to the case. She confirmed what the bouncer had seen. Harris had a terrifying, volatile temper. He was a man capable of sudden, explosive outbursts. But beyond his anger, there was one specific detail she shared that made the detective's blood run cold. She explained that whenever they used to drive home from the bar, they would take a series of dark backroads to avoid running into the police. And almost every time they passed one specific stretch of remote wooded highway, Harris would look out into the trees and say the exact same thing. That would be the perfect place to dispose of evidence. He said it casually, like a throwaway joke, but he said it enough times that it permanently stuck in her memory. Detectives immediately asked her to show them the spot. The lead investigator, the ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend, piled into a car and drove down that back road with the windows rolled down. About 200 meters into the woods, the wind shifted, and they all caught it. The unmistakable, grim scent indicating that something was no longer alive. The lead detective's heart started pounding. He later admitted his first thought was, "I hit the lottery. There's no way it's going to be this easy, but I think we just found her." They slammed on the brakes, got out on foot, and pushed their way through the thick brush, following the chilling scent. And they did find something. But it wasn't Nicole. It was discarded animal remains. Animal remains left in the exact spot where Jonathan Harris repeatedly fantasized about hiding a victim. Make of that what you will. Nicole was still missing, but the walls were rapidly closing in on Big John. Searching the Pacific Northwest is not like searching a city. There are thousands of acres of dense, unforgiving timberland where you could walk for hours and never see another human being. But thanks to the cell phone pings and that fateful breathalyzer selfie, they had a target area south of Lake Kapowsin. Specially trained search dogs were brought to a remote tree farm. For days, they pushed through the thick brush, coming up empty, until the dogs caught a scent. It was June 20th, 2015, the day before Father's Day. Deep down in a steep wooded ravine, about 25 yards off a logging road, searchers found what they were looking for. Nicole's remains had been double-wrapped in a green tarp and a heavy painter's canvas. She had been tossed down the embankment and discarded like she meant nothing. The lead detective made the heaviest phone call of his career. He reached out to Nicole's father, Eddie, to deliver the devastating update. He explained that they had finally located his daughter, but gently warned him to brace himself for the most heartbreaking outcome possible. Eddie later said something that perfectly captures the impossible, crushing contradiction of a parent's grief. He said, "I got a gift. They found my daughter." On Father's Day weekend, he received confirmation that his child had tragically lost her life, and he called it a gift because the agonizing wait was over. At least now she could come home. When an examination was conducted, the findings revealed a devastating physical ordeal. She had sustained an immense amount of physical trauma. The sheer impact on her body was extensive, but there was one critical detail concerning her arms and hands. They displayed defensive wounds. It means that in her final moments, Nicole didn't just give up. She tried to shield herself. She fought back. But when the expert was asked to describe the type of force required to cause this specific pattern of profound damage, the medical conclusion was horrifying. The injuries pointed to a massive, completely one-sided display of physical force. Let that sink in. Remember what I told you at the beginning of this story. Nicole was 4'10". Jonathan Harris was a massive 6'7". The physical mismatch alone is horrifying. With the sheer extent of the trauma, this wasn't a fight. It was an annihilation. Investigators finally pieced together the grim reality of that night. They believed Nicole drove Harris back to his house in Graham. The moment the doors closed, that explosive anger he displayed at the bar finally boiled over. He committed an unspeakable, tragic act inside his home. Then, the massive bouncer wrapped her tiny frame in a tarp, loaded her into the back of her own car, and drove out to Lake Kapowsin. He threw her down the ravine, parked her car between the trees to stage an accident, ripped off the license plates and walked home. And later that same day, he drove his truck right back to those woods, just to look at what he'd done. But to start his engine and leave, he had to blow into his breathalyzer. At that exact moment, the device's hidden camera snapped a photo, permanently documenting his presence at the scene. Once Nicole was recovered, the forensic dam broke. Detectives went back to Jonathan Harris's house with a fine-tooth comb. This time, They found exactly what he had tried to scrub away: physical evidence of a severe struggle on the carpet, forensic evidence on the walls. DNA analysis quickly confirmed it belonged to Nicole. They tested the hoodie Harris had been wearing at the bar that night. Nicole's DNA was on it. His alibi was destroyed. His cell phone placed him at the dump site. The victim's DNA was in his living room. Up until this exact moment, you might have thought what happened to Nicole was a tragic, spontaneous crime of passion, just an intoxicated giant who lost his temper because he saw his ex-girlfriend. If you think that, you are dead wrong. When digital forensics analyzed Harris's laptop, the entire narrative flipped. This wasn't a spontaneous incident. In the weeks and days leading up to his dates with Nicole, Jonathan Harris had actively been searching the internet for highly disturbing terms related to harming others, dark compulsions, and unthinkable tragic outcomes. This wasn't a man who just snapped. This was a man with a dark, terrifying obsession, actively researching unthinkable acts of malice and how to end someone's life. When you combine that search history with the fact that he was swiping through Tinder and Plenty of Fish every single day, the reality is chilling. He wasn't casually dating, he was hunting. And Nicole, trusting, hopeful, and just looking for a fresh start, walked right into his trap. 3 days after Nicole was found, Jonathan Harris was formally charged in connection to her tragic passing. But when he made his first court appearance, he didn't look like a man whose life was over. He stood in front of the judge, and he smirked. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted the police. He had no idea about the mountain of evidence waiting for him. When his defense team finally showed him the DNA results, the cameras, the laptop searches, and his own stupid breathalyzer selfie, that arrogant smirk vanished. He ultimately signed a plea agreement, pleading guilty to a severe second-degree felony for taking Nicole's life. But then Harris did something unexpected. Less than a month after entering his guilty plea, Harris fired his attorney. He demanded to withdraw his plea. He claimed he had been pressured into it, that he hadn't really wanted to plead guilty, that his lawyer had pushed him into a deal he didn't understand. And then came the interview. A reporter, Kevin McCarty, sat down with Harris, and during that interview, McCarty asked him the question directly: "Did you take Nicole White's life?" Harris's answer: "I don't know. I don't know. Not, no. Not I didn't do it. Not I'm innocent." He said, "I don't know." How do you not know if you ended someone's life? Either you did or you didn't. That answer alone tells you something. It's not a denial. It's a deflection. It's a man who already pleaded guilty trying to figure out how to walk it back without actually saying the words "I didn't do it," because he knows that he can't. It was a useless deflection. The judge saw right through him. On September 23rd, 2016, Judgment Day arrived. The courtroom was heavy with grief. Nicole's father, Eddie, and her sister Melissa sat in the gallery, the shattered remnants of a family destroyed by a stranger. The prosecutor looked at the judge and stated clearly, Mr. Harris knew exactly what he was doing the night he attacked Nicole White. Harris was sentenced to 26 years and 4 months behind bars. His appeals were swiftly denied. Nicole believed she was safe. She met him in public. She told her family where she was going. But as this case proves in the most terrifying way possible, sometimes the monsters don't hide in the shadows. Sometimes they smile, buy you a drink, and wait for you to swipe right.